again because the Ultimaker failed me. The top of my actuator is missing. So that's going to be all for today. And I'm going to have to restart this with a better print of the main body. I do have another print here. Is it the right version? This says 6.1.3, so I'm thinking this is actually a slightly out of date one. Question is, has it printed okay? But I don't think I have time to, well, maybe I should give it a go. You can see here that I had the brim switched on, and so there's a lot of extra material here that needs removing. If you use the smart brim correctly and follow the right print settings, you don't have to do this. One thing this is telling me is that I probably do want to improve my quality control procedures on the 3D printed parts. I mean, clearly this is all stuff that you'd notice while you're building it, but it's a bit sad to have all your parts printed and then find out that you can't actually assemble a microscope because something didn't quite print correctly. And the troublesome thing is that with the actuator columns, because the complicated bits are all embedded inside the plastic, it's very hard to check that they've printed well until you're actually assembling it. I'm not quite sure what the problem was. I think maybe it was under extruding a bit. Right, that's just about cleaned up. And then I've got to do all of the things that are described in the cleanup again. I've got to remove the ties here. And I'm going to give the top of this a poke. Looks okay. Not forgetting, of course, the ties here. I'm actually just going to put this on the bench. It makes it easier to apply some force and cut the ties, but without risking chopping through the flexures at the bottom. I realise it probably makes it a bit harder for you to see what I'm doing, which is why I didn't do that the first time. There we go, ties and brim all removed. That looks like the actuators are moving correctly. And of course I need to disassemble all the stuff out of this. I'm not going to completely disassemble the actuators because there's not a lot to be gained from that. I'm going to try the Z Actuator on here first because it seems that that's the one that fails. So it screws in nicely, which is usually a good sign. If it's too hard to screw in, that often indicates that the part printed a bit wonky. there we go. I gave it a pull rather than over tightening the screw to embed the nut, but the nut is now embedded. I'm going to take my Z foot, put the band tool back in. We don't have a particularly rigid protocol for the best way to hook the band in. There's a method described in the instructions. Whether you put the band on the tool and then put the tool and the band through the foot, or whether you put the band on the foot and then put the tool into it, probably varies depending on the size of your fingers. Right, now I'm going to try and click this in. Didn't hear any clicks. I'm going to keep holding my nut tool. Still no clicks. Try loosening that gear at the top. Everything's held on here correctly. There we go. That was a double click. I can pull out my tool. Should be able to pull out my tool. It's all a bit tight for space in here. Ah, right, the foot didn't quite click in correctly to the base. There we go. And so now you can see that as I tighten that gear, the Z-axis is moving down. So there we go, one correctly assembled Z-axis. Lovely. So I just need to do that for the other axes. But before I do that, I need to check my department coffee. Because normally we all meet for coffee about this time. And sadly, COVID restrictions mean we are not allowed to. And it is my duty to send out the invite. Right, I have sent my weekly reminder to my colleagues to go and have some coffee. I should probably do the same very shortly, but I'm going to try and assemble my actuators. I am sad that this main body failed me. Let us hope that the other one works. I'll have to retrieve the nuts that I embedded in this earlier as well. Right, this one is going to be trickier because you can see the band is actually in here. And I'm going to use my trusty pair of tweezers to try and flick the band off the little hooks at the top of the actuator column. There we go. That was one side. The other side will be easier, of course, because there's much less tension on it. There we go. Retrieve my gear and bolt. give that a squeeze to pop the nut out. Put the dead main body to one side. Right, so slide the nut in. There is a tool for this, but unless your print has come out very tight, usually gravity will slide it into place. Actually, that hasn't quite gone into place, so I'm going to push it in with the tool. It's rather more reliable to do it with the tool. Give that a pull. You see the nut has moved up, but it's not properly embedded. There we go. Right, this one I probably do need to actually screw in. And then once you can feel some resistance, you need to go just a little bit further, and that should embed the nut in the plastic. And so when I unscrew this, hopefully you'll see the screw thread come back into view, and you'll see the nut is actually embedded in the top of the nut trap. That's what we're intending. So I'm going to pop my nut insertion tool back in to lock the actuator column in place. I'm going to get my X foot, my band insertion tool, I'm going to pop this on like so, and pop the tool through the foot. So this is exactly as described in the instructions, and you know what, it actually was easier than the shortcut I took. And I'm going to pop the foot on. It sometimes needs a bit of a click to get into place. I'm making sure that nut tool is still holding the actuator column in position. I'm going to push up, and by virtue of not being forced out of the actuator column by the band, I think that has worked. Excellent. Right, 2 out of 2 so far. That's good odds, and that all looks nice and tight. So one more to go. As before, stick the nut in there. Now it's important to make sure that there's a corner of the nut pointing out, and it's much easier to get it the right way around if you use the nut tool. And I'm going to put the screw in. Because I reused these from the first main body that you saw, they already have been lubricated, so I don't need to worry about repeating that step. In it goes. I'm going to pull on it to get the nut embedded in the top, and you can see that that nut has disappeared, so that's properly in. Put the nut tool back in. And then insert the final band. If that goes in, then I have the trickiest part of the assembly all done, which will be very nice, because I have now had 2 bodies that looked like they printed okay but actually didn't print okay. So here we go. I'm going to push up, and you can see that's still springy, so clearly that didn't go in. Let's try that again. Click, click. Right, and now, I snapped my elastic band. I suppose I did reuse that elastic band. Tut tut. This is why the kits generally include a couple of spare bands, because if you're going to break something during the assembly, it is usually an elastic band. My success rate had been pretty good up until today. Right, let's try that again. So let's get the foot in place. Nut tool in here. Ooh, you can see that I clearly didn't embed my nut too tightly. That came down again. Let's put the nut tool in, and you can see here that that's going to prevent the actuator column moving up. And then right, there we go. That was a nice positive click from both sides, and you can see the band is held tightly inside the actuator column. Lovely. Right, one assembled precision translation stage for an OpenFlexure microscope. And yeah, that's the tricky bit. I can put my band assembly tool to one side. I'm going to go back to the instructions and move on to the next step. So the next step is the optics module. Which point I suddenly realised that I need to get some things out of the bag. Because I have misplaced my objective lens. That is unfortunate. Right, one objective lens. Of course, what I haven't located is my tube length correction lens. I'll search for that in a moment. I'm going to use a 40 times objective lens today because it's air immersion and that's just much easier to work with. Right, seems I've failed my own challenge and forgotten to bring one of the crucial components, which is the lens that sits inside the optics module. So I'm not going to be able to finish that bit today. This, I suspect, is my comeuppance for being slightly blasé about having all the components I needed. So I have lots and lots of condenser lenses, but none of the tube lens correction lenses. At least none that are not otherwise built into a microscope. So I think what I may do is put the optics module to one side, go on to the next bit. course, the next step is mounting the optics in the microscope. So I'll skip ahead to the illumination for the purposes of getting as much of it as possible assembled today. So for this, I'll need my condenser, Allen key, soldering stuff. Well, I've got a pre-made wire, so I'm not going to use the soldering stuff. I need the illumination thumb screw, which is this part, and the illumination dovetail, which is this part. I also need a condenser lens. Actually, I do have plenty of those. And some of the nuts and screws. I'm currently struggling to remove the lens from its little bag. Right. I'm going to skip the step about soldering the LED. And so the first thing to do is to mount the dovetail on the main body. So it goes here, and there's a screw and a washer in each of the mounting holes, like so. Screw this in to the nut that we embedded in the main body. Now, I think this is where... this is where my swapped out main body comes back to bite me, because, of course, I haven't embedded the nuts, because I had to swap that main body out. So I'm going to pop the nuts back out of this one. Not because M3 nuts are particularly valuable, but because we recycle our failed prints, and I suspect the recycling people won't appreciate having metal nuts embedded in their plastic. I could imagine that would make a right mess of the plastic recycling process. Although I dare say they have measures in place to deal with slightly dirty input. But I can certainly attest that these nuts were quite nicely embedded in the stage, because that took quite a lot of force to pop them out. Right. So, as before, got the nut tool to push these in. It's a bit tight. A little bit of spaghetti inside that nut trap that I'll clean up. A little bit of spaghetti inside this one too. No, there was already a nut in there. Right, that goes in much more easily. And I am being slightly naughty here and trying to skip a step by screwing straight into the nuts without embedding them first. I did do it properly the first time around, but then I ran out of time. And I am proving to you that you shouldn't try and skip steps of the instructions, because it would be much easier if I just did it the right way around and embedded the nut using screw just like it says. Give that a few cranks to get it properly embedded in the plastic. Take it out again, into the next one. I feel like some kind of torque limiter plus electric screwdriver combo would make this much quicker. But as I am not assembling 10 of these, I don't think I'm going to do that. Right, now that they're nicely embedded, I can fix the illumination dovetail. Done. The next step is to push fit the lens. Note that there is a right way and a wrong way for the lens to sit. So the lens on here wants to go bumpy side up. And then we will take the condenser and carefully line it up with the lens and click it into place. There we go. Sometimes the flange on the edge of the lens will crack a little. So long as you don't have a big crack going across the actual optical aperture, that is not a problem. And as you can see, there are no loose bits falling out, so that's fine. Then we want to add the condenser retaining screw. So for this, we need to drop an M3 nut into the nut trap. You can see that sits in there. Then use your remaining long hex-headed bolt in the little thumb screw, and you can push that on your bench to make sure it's embedded, and then screw that in from the side. This nut trap is not like the other ones, so you're not trying to embed the nut. That's that. Then we mount the condenser arm by sliding it in so it's approximately flush with the top. So when that nut is loose, it should slide. I mean, it's intended to be a little bit tight, but not immovable. And then once that is tightened, it should be really quite hard to move. So that's that in. Next step is to push fit the LED. And this is the part where I cheat and bust out a pre-assembled LED cable. And so the LED just push fits in the top. This part we're definitely going to replace with a little PCB that is much easier to mount. Wow, that's actually really quite hard to get in. That's printed slightly more tightly than usual. I'm going to use a metal ruler to give me a bit more purchase here. I wonder if my LED is slightly bigger than 5mm. Right. It took a bit more force than I was expecting, but you can see the LED is now in. It's not fully embedded actually, but it's in. There we go. The next step is to assemble the motors. I'm going to need my thread lock for this, so I'm going to disappear for a moment. So we have some motors, and we need the 3 small gears, the cable tidy caps, the M4 screws, and the same 2.5mm Allen key. The M4 screw is a button head, partly because I think it's pretty, and partly because it means that we can use the same Allen key between the M4 screws and the M3s. So we take 1 stepper motor and 1 small gear. Move the other things to the side. Stepper motor, small gear, but the stepper motor facing up. Small drop of thread lock adhesive on either side of the motor shaft. And this is to stop the gear coming off. Place the motor on, align the flat sides of the motor shaft to the flat sides of the hole in the gear, and push the gear on with the flanged side next to the motor, like so. This should be a tight fit, not excessively tight, but tight enough to stay on, and then the thread lock will stop it slipping off again. Then we repeat this for the other 2 motors. Blob, 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 push fit, push fit, and put the cap back on my thread locker. Right, so we now have the gears on the motors. The next step is to put the motors on the microscope. So let's try the X actuator, that's what it says we should start with. Get my Allen key and parts ready. We should really have X, Y and Z on these, I think. So we feed the cable through first. This is one of the big changes for V7, that we now have proper cable management, which I think makes a real difference to how sort of device-like the thing feels. Place that on, check the gear is meshed correctly, which it is. Then we take the X cable tidy cap, get that all fed correctly, and the lugs for the cable tidy cap go above the lugs for the motor, like so. Check cable is running through the cable tidy like this. So actually, as I had it, it was pinched underneath, which is a bit messy and can damage the cables. So if we tuck that in neatly, you'll see those cables now, they kind of disappear inside. Now we secure it in place with the 2 M4 screws. the M4 screws are still threaded directly into the plastic. We've generally found that this works okay, but we're considering replacing the M4s with M3 screws, partly just to reduce our bill of materials a bit, because it's always annoying to need multiple kinds of screw, and partly because some people have reported that they have damaged the motor lugs when assembling this step. And as with the moving stage, it's really annoying when you damage something on the main body, because it's the big single piece print. So I think if we follow Julian's excellent suggestion and use nut traps instead, this will all work better. Right, so that's my X actuator motorized and assembled. Going to do the same thing for Y. So feed my cable through first. Pop it into the cable tidy cap, and make sure that the wire is hooked in nicely and not pinched. Assemble that on top of the microscope and then fix it in place with a couple of screws. These self-tapping holes are something we worked on for a while. They're somewhere between a triangle and a cylinder, which means that there is just enough free space that when you screw a machine screw into it, it self-taps reasonably nicely, despite not being designed as a self-tapping screw. It's sort of effectively a self-tapping hole. Now, the Z cable tidy works fine for the motor, but currently doesn't really work for the LED cable because there's no hole here. I am going to be slightly nasty and make a hole with my pliers if I can. Nope, I think I'm going to need something to snip that with. And I didn't bring anything. And I don't think my little craft knife is going to cut through this much plastic. No. Right, I'm going to cut this. This, I think, is one of the very few physical changes that's slated for Alpha 2, because it will allow us to actually assemble it properly. So, revert back to the instructions. Get the motor on the cable tidy cap, make sure that the cable is not pinched. Then the Z1 goes kind of the other way around from the other two motors. Oops, no, I should really have paid attention to the instructions and threaded this first, like I did for the other two. So, thread the cable through. Check it's not pinched, which it's not, and assemble that together. And actually, because I've done that cutout, I'm going to sneakily put my illumination cable through at the same time. Our plan is that the illumination cable will run nicely down through this dovetail part. That's just not done yet. It's the sort of thing that for many years, because I was basically only ever using this in my lab, I never worried about. But now that OpenFlexure microscopes are starting to make it into more places, actually having dangling cables everywhere was getting to be a bit of a problem. So having those cables properly managed, I think really makes it just feel a bit more like a proper instrument, which is nice. Is that properly down? Ah, yes, okay. My screw isn't fully in. The other disadvantage of tapping into the plastic is that it's not always obvious when a screw is tight. Ah, there it is. That's the tight point. Because there's quite a lot of friction when you're cutting the thread, and that then moves quite smoothly into damaging the thread. But there we are. Right, that is now fully assembled with all the wires coming out the bottom, so they will go into the base. Next page. So now we can attach the sample clips. Again, I was naughty and didn't reinsert my nuts when I replaced the main body, so I'm going to do that now. And note that you want to hold the moving stage when you do this rather than the base of the microscope, in order to avoid putting any torque through the legs of the stage, because that is the part of the microscope that is easiest to destroy by accident. And even though I'm not going to use them, I should probably just put these in, because this is my test assembly, and I wouldn't be testing the instructions very well if I ignored them. And I'll just gloss over the fact that I've already deviated from them. But it's an alpha, and it's my first one. My print failed on me, so... There we go. Right, so the sample clips I can pop on just by sticking my screw in there. And actually I need a thin M3 2.5mm Allen key. And I can screw that onto the stage like this. You'll see there's 4 holes and only 2 sample clips. That's because there's a variety of different ways you might want to clip a sample on. You can use any of the holes with the sample clips, particularly now that we've redesigned the illumination so that the illumination doesn't knock the sample clips. There we go. And there are also other alternatives to the sample clips that work slightly better with different types of and And actually this is where the instructions end, just so that it looks finished. Even though I've not done my optics module, I'm going to complete the assembly by mounting the microscope onto the base. This mounting lug is a bit too small and tight, which is surprising. I suspect this might be one of the things that Julian has fixed. Yeah, so the mounting lugs on the actual v7 release have slightly bigger holes, which then makes it a bit easier to get these screws in, because at the moment I'm kind of tapping into the plastic, which isn't really intentional. Once that's screwed into the nut that's embedded in the plastic, it won't be a problem anyway, because the thread in the steel nut is much stronger than any threading into the plastic that we've done by accident, and so that will strip and self-correct. Previous versions of the microscope kind of push fit on, and so the screws here were, I won't say optional, but if you didn't put them in, the microscope would still kind of fit together and look okay. These screws are now deliberately not optional, because while the microscope previously would fit together and look okay, if you picked it up, then the sensitive mechanical bit would fall off the base, and that was both embarrassing and obviously problematic for the device. So we took the decision to make it deliberately work very badly without these screws properly done up. I'm a little perplexed what's happening here. Do I have a roll nut? My screw is just spinning round and round. I think I may have failed to embed that nut properly. Or possibly my... no, the screw is turning. So I think this nut trap has somehow not worked properly. I remain a bit mystified by that. I appear neither to be able to screw it in nor unscrew it, which is a bit frustrating. It does look like there is a nut embedded in there. Not quite sure what's gone on. We'll have to look into that later. But I believe I do now have at least the mechanical bits of a correctly assembled version 7 alpha, which is very nice. I have waited a while to get my hands on one of these. So it's really good that I've got one. And cable management issues aside, I think this is going to be very fun. And I will have to do part 2 where I assemble the optics and electronics. Because currently I'm missing the lens that goes in here. So that is all for today, folks. Thanks to anyone who tuned in and anyone who watches this recording. And I'll be very interested to see if anyone finds it helpful. Goodbye.